Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of The Fantasy Birds. Today, we are going over the top 12 overall rankings in fantasy basketball. NBA season is just around the corner, so let's hop into these rankings and tiers of these players to give you a better idea of how we feel about them and how we're adjusting them coming into our fantasy basketball drafts. But let's hop right into our top 12 rankings. We're going to start from 12 and work our way up to 1. The first guy we're going to put here is going to be Ja Morant, the point guard for the Memphis Grizzlies. Ja Morant really had an incredible season last year, averaging right around 27 points, 5 rebounds, and almost 7 assists. So really made a huge jump compared to the season before. And if you think Ja Morant is going to continue on that arc to becoming that superstar top 10 overall player in the NBA, there's no reason not to draft him in the second round and even late first round. I mean, we saw Ja Morant become a top 15 player in fantasy at the end of last year as the Grizzlies made it to the Western Conference Finals. With 27 points a game and 7 assists, he really puts himself in an elite category of point guards in fantasy basketball. So we have no problem jumping on him early in the second round of your drafts, especially if he can get that 3-point made up to 2 per game. Last year sat around 1.5, but shooting nearly 50% from the field for a guy who averages nearly 28 points, incredible numbers for Ja Morant. We only expect him to get even better this season, so that's why we love taking him in the early second round of any of your drafts. At number 11, we're going with Anthony Davis, the power forward for the Los Angeles Lakers. The only problem with Davis is going to be that injury concern, and I know a lot of people are going to completely take Anthony Davis off their draft boards, given the fact that he's going to miss 15 to 20 games every single year. But in an NBA day and age where guys are taking off back-to-backs and missing games for rest reasons, I don't personally have a problem going with Davis at the end of the first round or even early second round if he slides there, due to the fact when he is healthy and playing, he's a top 5 overall player in fantasy basketball. 23, 10, 2.5 blocks a game. Last season, the shooting numbers from three-point were abysmal for Davis, the worst of his entire career, shooting around less than 20% from the three-point line. But I'm not going to hold that against Davis. I mean, last year, the Lakers looked atrocious for a majority of the season. So this year, fresh season coming into it, LeBron, AD, we saw what they did a couple years back on that championship run. Davis, like I said, if he is healthy and playing, he's a top 5 player in fantasy. So you're already getting that discount on him going at the end of the first round, given the fact that he's going to miss games. He's missed games every single year of his career. It's just who he is, unfortunately. But I'm willing to pay this back end of the first round price tag, knowing I'm going to get nearly 25, 12 rebounds a game coming into a year where he's been scrutinized all offseason for low effort and durability issues. So I have no problem paying this tag for Anthony Davis in the end of the first round. Rounding out our top 10 and this lower tier, we have Trey Young, the point guard for the Atlanta Hawks. Young does get a new backcourt mate with DeJounte Murray coming over in the offseason trade, which should lower his volume this upcoming season, but we only expect that to increase his efficiency. I mean, last season we saw Trey Young pulling up from half court, doing shots that we don't normally see from point guards of teams, but he was kind of forced into that role given the primary ball handler on his team. So with DeJounte Murray coming in, he should be able to alleviate some of that pressure in the offense. Giving Trey Young more efficient looks, should see an increased field goal percentage and three-point percentage this season. And look for Trey Young to play more off-ball while DeJounte Murray handles a little bit of that load on offense. Trey Young's still going to be the primary ball handler, given he's a top 10 offensive player in this game. So for a guy averaging 28 and 10 assists last season, given we should see some increased inefficiency this upcoming year, I have no problem taking Trey Young at the end of the first round. At number 9, we're going with the Finals MVP, Stephen Curry. Amazing championship run for the Warriors last season, led by Curry. And we project him to be a very solid fantasy player yet again, like we've seen over the past 6 years of his career. Last season, right around 26 points, 5 rebounds, and over 6 assists, so great numbers for Curry. He is entering into his age 34 season, which is the only concern for Curry, but we've seen production from him for so many years that even if there's some slight regression in his numbers, he should still be a top 15 fantasy player. For a guy who doesn't get injured that often, especially later in his career, he's been very healthy. I don't mind taking Curry in the middle of the round, especially if you get him guys like we're going to talk about in a second. Right next to Curry, we're going with Jayson Tatum, the small forward for the Boston Celtics. Only reason we have Tatum above Curry, one, the durability issues aren't a concern for either of these players, but Tatum in particular doesn't seem to ever get injured. Cross our fingers for that again. But Tatum entering into age 24 season, he's entering into his prime, so this is a guy we love betting on in fantasy, guys that we don't know if we've seen their ceiling yet. Tatum was so good last year, carrying that team to the playoffs, running into Curry in the finals, but a guy who's already averaging 27 points per game with 8 rebounds, dishing out a career high in assists last year, Malcolm Brogdon coming into Boston should alleviate some of that pressure off of Tatum so he can focus more on being the elite scorer that he is. We already knew this team was great defensively, but they should be even more polished offensively, getting that point guard that they desperately needed with Brogdon this offseason. We only think that's going to help Tatum this year. He could be a 30 points per game kind of guy this year if everything goes right in Boston. So I love taking Jayson Tatum in the first round, knowing you're going to get a guy who's going to play a majority of the games, which is very valuable in fantasy basketball, considering how often guys are taking games off and resting with injuries. So Tatum, a guy you know is going to play, and a guy who could jump to that 30 points per game mark this season. No-brainer for me taking Tatum. In the B tier, we're going with James Harden, which could be pretty controversial given how poorly James Harden played at the end of the season. We saw him dealing with some nagging injuries that limited his production in the playoffs and even at the end of the regular season. But if James Harden is to be fully healthy and get in great shape coming into the year, we've seen Harden be so dynamic in fantasy. I mean, he's a top 4 player the last 3 years of his career, given how well he's doing on offense, getting assists at an elite clip, and also putting the ball in the hoop. So at such a dynamic offensive player, even given some regression that we're going to see this year, we're not worried about Embiid's volume being a hindrance on Harden. We saw them play together, and Harden still putting up over 40 fantasy points a night with them playing together. It did tail off at the end, but we think that's due to some injuries that he was dealing with. So a guy who's getting 10 assists and nearly 23 points per game, James Harden, definitely lower than what he was last year. Last year, he was the number 4 player in fantasy. This year, he's sliding to number 7 in our rankings. So we're already baking his performance regression into this ranking. But if you're getting a guy who's averaging double-digit assists late in the first round, I mean, I'll take the beard and hope the regression was an outlier at the end of last season. Next, we got LeBron James. It might be disrespectful to put LeBron James in the same tier as James Harden, looking at how Harden finished his last year. But LeBron James, a guy entering his age 37 season, still putting up elite numbers across the board. Last year, he averaged 30 points per game at 36 years old. I mean, this is incredible production for a guy his age. Just shows how well he's taking care of his body. But he's not only doing it in the scoring category. He's assisting, he's rebounding, he's doing every single thing for this Lakers team, and we project that to continue this upcoming season. I mean, a steal, a block per game, 6 assists, 8 rebounds, still shooting right around 50% from the field. We saw LeBron James take over some games at the end of last year. Not enough for the Lakers to make the playoffs, as he got absolutely zero help from Westbrook and Anthony Davis. But still, LeBron James is a top 3 NBA player to this day. And in fantasy, I want to be betting on a guy who's getting 30 points a night with 8 rebounds and almost 7 assists. So LeBron James, definitely a guy we want to be targeting. We're not worried about the age. I mean, we just saw him do this at age 36. His numbers might come down slightly, but even at that, he's still going to be a top 10 player, no doubt about it. Right above LeBron James, we're going with Kevin Durant, the small forward, power forward for the Brooklyn Nets. A lot of rumors this offseason of getting traded. He demands a trade. Then he decides to come back to Brooklyn. Don't really know what's going on with that, but he's going to be a Brooklyn Net this season. Even with all this drama, he should be a very valuable fantasy asset yet again. Some argue the most talented offensive player in the NBA, and it's hard to argue with that when he's putting up 30 points a game at such a high efficiency clip, shooting over 50% from the field when primarily shoots from outside the paint. Pretty ridiculous for Kevin Durant. So this is a guy definitely we want to be betting on, especially with James Harden not being a part of this team this year. Should create a lot more opportunities for Kyrie and Kevin Durant to be more ball dominant this season, especially if Ben Simmons plays, is healthy, and can alleviate some of that defensive pressure off of Durant's shoulders. Should open him up to be more offensive minded. 2 threes a game, shooting over 90% from the free throw line and 50% from the field in general. Kevin Durant, even with all this drama in the offseason, still a guy I want to be picking in the middle of the first round if you miss out on the top 4 guys that we're going to talk about here. In the next tier, we're putting Joel Embiid as the number 4 player off the board, and I'm putting him in a tier of his own just to separate him from the guys below him, but also show how dominant the 3 guys above him are going to be this season. If you get the 4th pick, Joel Embiid is my favorite player. Wins the scoring title last year, and we're not worried about the James Harden addition to this team. A lot of people were worried James Harden was going to pound the ball. Embiid's usage was going to come significantly down, hindering his numbers. Was not the case at all. Embiid, clearly the number 1 guy on this Philly team at the end of last season. Still goes and gets 30 points a night with your 11 rebounds, assists, steals, blocks. He really does everything well for this team. Even shoots threes, is one of the most talented big men in the NBA. Winning the scoring title last season at the center position. Very impressive stuff from Embiid. Almost got MVP, but it went to back-to-back Jokic. So Embiid is clearly my favorite pick in fantasy drafts if you're not able to get the top 3 guys. should be a standalone guy above the rest of these players that we've already talked about. Go get yourself the process. There is significant injury risk with Embiid. We've seen it in his career. I mean, a guy over 7 feet tall, that big, that strong. It's going to be hard to maintain your health through an 82-game season. But with so many injuries across the entire NBA, it's not something I want to hold against him. I want to be betting on his points per game, his volume, and his efficiency in that Philly offense. Should be great yet again for the 76ers. The first guy in our S tier and the number 3 player in our rankings, Luka Doncic for the Dallas Mavericks. This guy is one of the most special players in the NBA, grabbing you nearly 30 points a game, 9 rebounds, 8 assists, a triple-double waiting to happen on a nightly basis. One of the most fun guys to watch and one of the most productive guys on the offensive end. It leaves a little bit to be desired on the defensive end, but this is fantasy basketball. We want to see those points, rebounds, and assists, and he's doing every single thing for you. We could see even more volume for him this season. Jalen Brunson signs with the New York Knicks, one of those key backcourt mates for him. So if it was possible, he could see even more of the ball in his hands. Christian Wood comes over to add some star power to this team. So if he's able to create some chemistry with Christian Wood, we could see even more assists, a new lob threat for Luka Doncic. We've seen him very, very actively throwing lobs to his power forwards and centers in pick and roll action. So if Wood's able to establish that role and be a dominant force, Luka could see even more open looks and efficient looks while getting his assists up at the exact same time. Also, at age 23, significantly younger than a lot of guys on this list, so he's still progressing in his career. Like we talked about with Jayson Tatum, we want to be catching these guys on the upswing of their career that have potential to be that number 1 overall player in fantasy basketball. And Luka Doncic definitely has that in the offense he's in Dallas with the players he has around him. Christian Wood and Spencer Dinwiddie facilitating that offense, making it even smoother for Luka this year. So for a guy as offensively gifted as Luka, definitely needs to be in your top 3. Do not let him get past the 3rd pick. There are arguments to be made for him to be at the number 1 or 2 pick, given how well he is producing. But I feel like the guys above him deserve their spots, given the talent that they have last season. If you want to take Luka over Giannis, given his ankle injury, there's an argument there, but I still want Luka at the number 3 spot in a clear tier ahead of Joel Embiid and the rest of the guys on this list. At number 2 in our rankings, we're going Giannis Antetokounmpo, my favorite player. I think the best player in the NBA. 30 points a game, 12 rebounds, 6 assists. Yes, he does have that ankle injury while he's playing in the EuroLeague, but he should be good for the regular season. He's already stopped playing, resting, mild ankle sprain, so he should be good, not a concern. But if you want to bump him down behind Luka, I could understand that for that reason. But I think Giannis is about to become on a pace to be the MVP this season and rattle off some championship rings. A guy who does it at every single level, points, rebounds, steals, blocks, 3-point and free throw percentages are a problem, but in points leagues, that doesn't matter to us, so we love taking Giannis as the number 2 player. I can see Giannis being the number 1 player if you're concerned about Michael Porter Jr. and Jamal Murray this year, but Giannis has made the game of basketball look so easy for 3 years now, getting 30 on a nightly basis like it's nothing to him. The best defensive player in the league and maybe the best offensive player in the league. Such a rare combination to have in a player. Makes him a clear top 2 pick for us this upcoming season in fantasy. Grab him if you have a top 2 pick and you will be very happy about your decision. No reason for him to slide past 3 in drafts. And at number 1, it's the back-to-back MVP, Nikola Jokic for the Denver Nuggets. I mean, if you wanted to create a fantasy basketball player, it would be Nikola Jokic. Literally does every single thing great in fantasy. Scores the ball, rebounds, assists, 3-pointers, free throws. You name it, Jokic does it. He's a fantasy basketball player created in a lab by someone. Clearly number 1 player. Even with Jamal Murray and Michael Porter Jr. coming back to this offense, we've seen them play together before, and Jokic is still a dominant force. So that's not something that's really concerning me. If you want to use that as a tiebreaker against Giannis, who should be healthy this season, I'm all for that, putting Giannis at number 1. But we've seen the back-to-back MVP do so well in this offense. I mean, teams focusing strictly on him, in the playoffs against the Warriors, throwing multiple guys at him at a time, and he's still producing high-level numbers. He should be even more efficient this season with those guys coming back and alleviating some of that pressure. Should increase his assist numbers, maybe points come down. But still, Jokic is so dominant across every single statistic. There's no reason you can't love taking Jokic as a top 2 player this season. If you get a top 2 player, you have a significant advantage this season in fantasy basketball, given the fact that you have the ability to grab a Jokic or a Giannis. Jokic is the number 1 player. That's going to wrap up our top 12 overall rankings this season in fantasy basketball. Let me know what you think of these players, and if you want to see more fantasy basketball content, hit that like button and subscribe. We're coming at it all season long We thank you guys for watching this episode of the Fantasy Birds, and we'll see you guys next week with another podcast.